Welcome to Dave and Dom Demystify, a FinTech Futures podcast, helping make sense of the world of FinTech and digital finance. Please sit back and listen as the two Ds take a subject and discuss it to make it clearer and easier to understand.
Demystify. Welcome everybody to the Dave and Dom Demystify show, and today we are in Dubai at 35 degrees. It's rather warm, but we're joined by a very special guest, Vinit Shah from VARA. Vinit, would you mind giving the audience a little bit of an intro on yourself and obviously of the company, please?
Absolutely. It's a great pleasure to meet with both of you and great to be on the show. My name is Vinit Shah. I am a senior advisor over at VARA. A long-time Dubai resident. I moved here in 2003 and I've seen the city go through all of its different forms to be a major commercial hub as it is today. I was part of the founding team at VARA, which is the Virtual Asset Regulatory Authority, with an intent to create a Web3 and a blockchain hub for the Emirate of Dubai. Our intent is to provide guardrails, a safe place for investors and individuals to come, operate, and flourish.
I mean, it's amazing the breadth of technology that Dubai is investing in, like, you know, from the government downwards. But and also when we look at like crypto globally, there seems to be like every country pretty much is looking at CBDCs. Where are you on the journey?
So CBDCs are something that we are looking at along with our federal regulator, which is the central bank, to see how they could be incorporated into the financial framework. So while there haven't been any that have been launched yet, but the central bank and VARA work very closely in order to ensure that we create a safe environment and we create use cases and understand the impact on the financial systems as the CBDCs come into play. But it's a question of when, not if. So it is something that is under consideration.
So I guess I just want to rewind slightly in terms of VARA itself. At what point was the decision made to set up the regulatory authority? And I guess having followed Web3 technologies, particularly in relation to the UAE and Dubai, what I've seen is that there's a lot more progressive thinking than maybe other jurisdictions. The region has embraced the opportunity. So when did the thought around VARA first get discussed and talked about, and how has that then progressed from that point?
Great question. I mean, so we had a lot of thinking time during COVID, and it was one of those key initiatives that we focused on as part of Dubai economy and tourism to see where the next impetus for economic growth might be for the city and then eventually for the country as a whole, right? We started thinking about VARA in the middle of 2021. And there was a tremendous amount of support that we got from the government. And the law was passed to create VARA in February of 2022. And then we took a good year to draft up the regulations. And we went live with our regulatory framework in March of 23. So it was a very quick journey to set up a brand new bespoke regulator, the first of its kind in the world.
That is extraordinary, actually, isn't it? So how did you manage to do it so quickly?
So the speed of decision making, one from the government, and secondly, the agility of all of us to move in step with the private sector allowed us to get to this point, right? So we started off looking at our peers across the world to understand what each one of had done in the space. And we had a program which we at that time used to call our MVP, our minimum viable product program, where we were in constant dialogue with the private sector to understand the challenges that they faced of operating in this sector in different parts of the world. And we took all of those learnings to essentially create this framework that was market acceptable as soon as we went live. The speed of decision making from the government is probably the single most factor that allowed us to move this fast.
I mean, it's so interesting because, you know, I think the government has shown itself time and time again, actually recently, that sort of speed and agility of thinking. And is part of a kind of broader economic plan, as you described. How connected are you into that plan? I guess what I'm trying to get at is the government has this view on what should happen, and then it needs people like yourselves to then execute against that plan. So how closely are you working with them?
So we work in conjunction with the government. So for example, Dubai has this D33 agenda, which is essentially an economic target that it has set itself for 2033. And one of the key aspects of the economic agenda is everything tech. So not just Web3 and blockchain, but you look at health tech, you look at agri-tech, you look at all types of tech in order for tech to provide a significant economic boost by 2033. And we play a small part in that role. And from a leadership perspective, we have His Excellency Hilal Al Murray, who is also the Director General for the Dubai Economy and Tourism, who is our chairman as well. So we are connected at the top, and then it all flows down to the bottom.
You're part of the founding team, right? So
Yes.
did you have a background in Web3? How did you get to grips with the technology? And the surprising thing about the timescales is getting to grips with something that is actually quite complex to understand and then putting a framework in place as well. So, like, can you give us a bit more detail about how you did it? How did you find the people, etc.?
Yeah. Before we started thinking about VARA, I had absolutely no clue about Web3 and blockchain. Right. So it was a lot of reading up. It was a lot of meeting with individuals who were in the space and trying to discern and learn from them on what this is all about. Obviously, a lot of sleepless nights, but but it's been worthwhile and fruitful. We also had external help, of course. So we had one of the big fours who was helping us on developing the operating model. And then we had one of the topmost legal firms helping us draft the regulatory framework. And that itself was a learning experience, right? Because we had to discern and understand what was happening in the market to translate it back into a regulatory framework. Finding people, that was another task. We were looking for a specific skill set. So we were trying to find people who were embedded in TradFi, who understood the basic principles of risk compliance in the traditional finance world and had exposure to a little bit of crypto. To find somebody who was native crypto was going to be impossible. So we did look at areas, we looked at banks, we looked at asset managers who had individuals with that specific skill set to come and set up the team. Just recently, we've had a couple of great joiners. One who is from the Bank of Ireland, another gentleman who was at Citadel Securities with a long background at Goldman Sachs. So we're trying to get people that have TradFi as their base and then are moving into crypto.
Fantastic. Just one other thing, I guess, I always like to ask this question. If I had to explain a virtual asset to my wife, how would you explain it?
I can say see clause number XXX in our rule book. But it's at the end, it's a very simple method, right? It's essentially taking, for example, if you have a piece of art, you break that piece of art into small pieces, and those small pieces then become virtual assets that you can then trade and do what with, and you have ownership. They call those NFTs in the sector and the industry. It's a virtual form of money, for example, right? So anything that holds value can become a virtual asset.
I mean, I guess on from that, when you think about sort of some of the guardrails that you mentioned, you're obviously looking to protect the consumer and the sort of business community. Are there some sort of examples of some of the regulations in terms of what you're doing to protect them? And is that right? Is that what VARA is trying to do, is to protect the end consumer?
So we're trying to protect both the end users and the investors, right? So for example, for the end users, we've just recently launched our new marketing guidelines. It's nothing new, but what it does is it prescribes what you can say in your marketing to individuals. So similar to what you have in traditional finance, when it says mutual funds tend to lose value, past performance is not an indicator of future performance. So simple things like that, which essentially...
You say simple things, but it's so good to hear that they're actually being delivered, because it's a bit like the Wild West in terms of marketing out there, isn't it?
Exactly that. And we just launched it, anticipating that this is the event season starting in Dubai, and this was a perfect time to get it out. It was an enhancement to some rules that we already had, but the idea is to have clear messages whenever a company is advertising about crypto. that there could be a possibility that somebody who invests will lose all their money. So you have to be careful. There are no promises made. You can't promise a 2000% return. So all of those things that you would normally not do in a TradFi world to be implemented into the Web3 and the crypto world.
So, I guess there's other use cases which I'd like to talk about, but in
course.
this example, are you doing the monitoring of what's happening out there? And I guess Vara's using AI. Is this one of the use cases for AI that you're using?
Not yet. It is being considered to support some of our internal processes. But in terms of the current situation, we have close relationships with, again, Dubai Economy and Tourism, who have inspectors that will essentially go out into the city and look at any messaging that is being put out. So either on billboards, hoardings, taxis, buses. We also have people in the team that essentially scour the web to see if there are people that are putting messages out there that are not in line with the marketing guidelines that have been put out. So there's support from that inspection front, and then we work very closely with the Dubai police to see if there is any enforcement action that is needed.
Which is great to hear. I've been campaigning for clean water in the UK, and I know what happens when the regulator actually doesn't do what they should be doing. So it's good to hear that there's actual enforcement on the back of.
Just recently, we fined 7 firms. I think there was a release about that last week, essentially for undertaking activities that were not in line with regulations.
And how joined up is this with, let's say, the tax? So the UK, I have to say, is not very progressed on the virtual asset side of things. But one of the things that they did straight away was to tell the banks not to transfer money to Coinbase and Binance and places like that were unregulated entities. But also they've told people that if you make any gains on these platforms that you're not meant to put money into, then you still have to declare it and pay the tax. Yeah. So they try to put a boundary around the exit and input of kind of sterling asset, cash, into the virtual space. How joined up is it here?
So from a tax perspective, we are very lucky because there is no individual tax. So the only tax is a 9% tax on corporate profit. So that doesn't really impact us as much. But from a tax perspective, I think that is the only impact somebody would have. So if you're a company who is operating here, you would have a 9% tax. As an individual, there is no capital gains.
So there's no need really to stop banks from transferring money into these things?
So banking has always been a little bit of a concern, but we've been able to, over the years since we've been established, been able to work with the banks, mainly from a perspective of trying to meet our regulatory requirements. Within the VARA regulations, every company that has clients is required to have a client money account so that client assets are kept segregated from company assets. And in case of any downfall, you know exactly you had $10 or $100 within your account at Coinbase, for example, that you would get that money back, and it's easily accounted for. So we've thought about that, and that was a big learning that we had from the FTX scenario that happened while we were drafting our regulations.
It's interesting because I went to Abu Dhabi Finance Week.
Yes.
I think maybe 2 years ago, and FTX was ongoing, but Binance were there. And it was interesting to see how connected, in a way, Binance was to at that moment in time. And I guess there's a warning around all of this in terms of the closeness that I guess countries and regulators get to some of these big platforms. So how do you look at the platforms and go, these are people we should be doing business with or not? Or is that just not part of the remit of
No, it's a mix of both, right? So obviously when we wanted to start up the regulator, we had to, or we would want to work with companies that have credibility, companies that are bigger and stronger and not as exposed to volatility in movement of these coins. So we obviously did look at that, but we look at everyone from a single lens of our regulatory framework. So do they have the right policies? Do they have the right risk frameworks? Even if they have any sanctioned individuals or politically exposed individuals, we would undertake enhanced due diligence to make sure that the company is capable of operating within our regulatory framework, regardless of who they are.
I mean, it's such a good example of why a regulatory framework is so critical.
Yeah.
But this is how you stop the sort of Wild West from happening. Because I think it's interesting to hear about everything technical for D33. And part of that has to be about Web3 technologies, but we've been through this sort of whole like hype cycle, and I guess we're coming out the other side, aren't we?
Yeah.
But the way to ensure that people are protected, I mean, it's such an obvious thing to say, is to make sure regulation is there.
Yeah, and the whole intent is not to stifle the industry. The intent is to provide guardrails that companies can operate within and ensure that people don't lose money in the along the way. We don't want to be a regulator that kills innovation, because this sector and this industry is going to keep evolving. Use cases are going to keep coming up, and we need to be in touch with what's happening on the ground to make sure that regulation is not far behind. Because normally when there is innovation, sometimes the regulator is lagging significantly behind. We want to close that gap a little bit.
What do you think are the biggest risks that you're trying to protect? Is it just people investing when they shouldn't be, if they don't understand what the assets are, etc.? Or is it like bad actors?
It's both. We obviously want to ensure that proper AML, KYC checks are done on individuals. We have guidelines that FATF provides us. And at the same time, we work closely with our federal regulator, Central Bank of UAE, and the Securities and Commodities Authority to ensure that we are all joined at the hip when we are looking at KYC AML. That's one big part of what we look at. And the second thing is, what policies and processes do you have in place to ensure investor protection? From cybersecurity, from marketing was one that I spoke to you about, corporate governance, all of those things get reviewed and looked at to make sure that you're capable to operate and do what you're claiming to say in your regulatory business plan.
I guess one of the interesting things about virtual assets is their globality. So within the sort of finance industry, normally the regulator is quite focused on domestic regulation and what the industry is doing domestically, whereas you have to take a much more global view. Did you find that a sort of real added complication in terms of putting the regulations together in the first place?
It is a added complication, and hence what we did when we were setting up the regulation, where we looked at our peer regulators, right? So we benchmarked exactly what Singapore, Hong Kong, UK, Switzerland, the US were all doing in that space. And we had early insights into MiCA as well, the regulation for Europe that has come out. And we tried to ensure that we have a benchmark that is high enough that the license from VARA means something. And it would be acceptable to any of these other global regulators that I spoke about, that the right amount of diligence has gone through before somebody has come out the other end to operate and provide services to the retail market. There will be significant amount of similarities when you compare MiCA requirements versus VARA requirements. All of this was done in order to ensure future interoperability between jurisdictions. I mean, this is again a growing sector. Not every country is ready to talk about interoperability or passportability between each jurisdictions, but it has to be a global collaboration rather than a global competition.
Yeah, this is going to be one of the questions I really wanted to ask. Was there's a lot of momentum here. You can genuinely, when you go to some of the conferences, feel it, right? And when we've spoken to DIFC and some of the other parts, it's all joined up, a collaboration, as you put it, between companies and the government, which is fantastic. Where do you see yourselves against your peers in other countries? Are you in the top 5%? Are you in the, where do you see that? Like, this was a race.
I mean, we are in a space that's quite unique, especially because we are bespoke and we are focused purely on virtual assets. A lot of our peers across the world deal with both. So, for example, the FCA deals with TradFi and it deals with crypto and Web3. We focus only on the virtual asset side of the business. And our peer in the UAE would be a Securities and Commodities Authority, which would look at everything TradFi. So it does put us in a very unique space. It does give us faster time to market with stuff. It does give us a lot of agility to move. So from a global peer perspective, we are quite unique in that sense.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, but it feels that maybe it's a model that other countries should be exploring. I mean, sadly, we're almost at time. So if people wanted to find out a bit more about VARA, is the website the best place to go? Or?
Yeah, so there is a website. Of course, you will find all of our regulations there, and any key updates will all be posted on the website, vara.ae. But if you want to reach out to us, there is a media@vara.ae please send us an email, or there's another email called varaconnect@vara.ae, and we will respond to you as quickly as we can.
Fantastic. Listen, that's been such a brilliant and insightful interview. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Dave and Dharm Demystify. We hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in next time as we take another topic and demystify it.